Hi, this is the fifth, last perhaps, video in my little series in this analysis on the Paltry Nude. Um, I had been speaking about the goldener nude of a later day, which I realized that as I was speaking, I just didn't come out and define. Uh, we we said that the golden nude suggested to us Venus. But if I were to say this phrase, the golden nude of a later day, it would roughly be equivalent to the Venus of her age. But again, clearly it's not Venus. Venus is the superlative. The Venus of her age is relative to other things of that time, quite impressive, but the roots are back in Venus, and this golden nude is therefore uh, inconceivable without reference to the nude of nudes, the Venus of Botticelli's painting. The Paltry nude was likewise inconceivable without reference to the Venus. Her Well, I'm going to put it this way, but when her journey ends, hyphen, the journey is held in abeyance. Um, when her journey ends, as her heels foam, she becomes one with the Venus, at least in that metaphorical um, backstory, where the Venus arises. She is born out of the foam of the sea. This, ironically, is how the Paltry Nude uh, ends her journey, although, as I said, a cyclic journey cannot have an end. And the end of the Paltry Nude's journey, as it were, is simply a transition to the progress um, experienced in the future of this goldener nude. I also wanted to emphasize just how much is implied in this poem. For one, I said that there's an implied analogy. Obviously, when you talk about something, a couple of things. Not only have I implied that there's a horizon, the poem has implied that there is a horizon, and moreover, there are clouds on that horizon. And this implied scene itself is a metaphor the or signifies a coming storm, which can either be figurative or literal. The horizon that is implied also becomes the basis for a secondary implication that the um, paltry nude goes over disappears from view in the same way as a ship goes over the horizon and disappears from view and experience. Um, Even earlier, we had an implied unreal condition. If you remember, we said the paltry nude and would have purple stuff upon her arms. But under what conditions? Well, she would have purple stuff upon her arms if she were not going on the voyage or on a voyage. So there are the things that they're kind of a ghostly, I guess I could say, a kind of um, uh, a ghostly structure that is constructed on top of the explicit structure in the poem. Moreover, the explicit structure or the explicit analogy is a negative one. We said, uh, not as when the goldener nude of a later day will go. And actually, let me read this entire sentence. Not as when the goldener nude of a later day will go, like the center of sea green pomp, in an intenser calm, scullion of fate, across the spick torrent, ceaselessly, upon her irretrievable way. Yeah, because this is a complex structure, maybe we could focus on a, a clear focal idea in it, not as when the golden nude of a later day will go across the Spic torrent. On the one hand, this is a contrast to the progress, the travel, the voyage of the Paltry Nude. The Paltry Nude traversed. Now, traverse and go across would maybe also seem to be very, very close relatives, having nearly the same meaning. Traverse does have this has the sense of motion, but it's not necessarily strictly in the context of moving from point A to point B. In fact, what did she traverse? She traversed a circle. She followed a pathway. Now, perhaps the pathway has a starting point and an ending point. As we know, if in the terms of a circle, the starting point is the ending point. But when you talk about going across, or she will go across the Spic torrent, we clearly have a separation between a point of origin and a point of destination, or at least multiple points of destination, or through points, maybe we could call them, that are distinctly different from where we started from. Now, if this is the Spic torrent, whatever that is, um, this itself, this going across, could be a moment in an overall cyclical pattern. We can't say that it's not, but strictly as we focus, again, it's all a matter of perspective. If I focus on this crossing, I have a point where I start and a point where I finish. But of course, when I say that I finish something, there is something that goes on, perhaps potentially out of sight of my perspective, in the very sense that the implied horizon separates me from what is on the other side of the Earth's curvature, and separates me and renders something unknowable to me, unknowable to experience. Moreover, the poem says that this this crossing occurs ceaselessly, um, which could mean this is a condition, something that is uh, a routine or a ritual, perhaps, that continues to happen without end. Perhaps there is a cyclic nature, and the Spic torrent confronts the golden nude, will confront the golden nude as she makes her progress in the same circle that the Paltry nude did. Now let's talk about what characterizes this future crossing. Well, there's more comparison. Like the center of sea green pomp, she herself is not the center of sea green pomp, but like the center of sea green pomp. And what is the center of sea green pomp meant to suggest to us? Well, I would say that, right? Like the center of sea green pomp, which seems to have something in common with Botticelli's Venus. Now, this would seem to be a little cheeky, wouldn't it? It's almost a caricature. First off, the word pomp. Pomp is a kind of a very showy, affected, highly self-concerned, and demonstrative. It's kind of performance. Now, clearly, there is some ostentation. There is formality to this, but there's a essentially an attempt to cloak the natural beauty, the nudity of the Venus with this beautiful pink garment as presented by perhaps the figure of Spring herself, as this figure of Venus is blown towards the shore of Cyprus. But we would never consider the Venus or anything in this poem to be remotely affected. It's, as we said, it's monumental. It's the hallmark um, of, of fine art. perhaps the great achievement in art of its time. Additionally, it's a reduction or a deflation of this by talking about sea green. Well, for one, there is green in the Venus, in the birth of Venus. However, we see no sea green here, or if so, it's very, very subtle. We see sky blue. Also, I'd like to talk about the use of sea green. If you notice, we have ceased to speak about the sea any longer. The sea was always the background. We're always talking about the of the sea, the voyage to the sea, the circle of her traverse of the sea. But now the sea has been removed. The sea only serves as a point of reference in, let's say, a continuum of shades of green that the artist could choose from to create his work of art. So the sea has ceased to be itself what is experience and to simply be a point of reference that's abstracted into use. Again, it's not because of what it of the adventure of the exposure that it promises or threatens, but it's of its reduction or its abstraction into use. Additionally, like the center, well, what's interesting too is you might even argue that the Venus is compliant with the rhythm in this scene. She is kind of off center. Originally, if she was standing straight, here she would have been off center. Uh, she could have been centered herself. She could have been standing up straight, but she would have been off center with reference to the overall painting. But here in her, I don't want to say it's her awkwardness, in her leaning, in her giving way without being completely under the sway of. She gives what the art needs. Um, it's as though that the conception of Venus has some give to her, and she will function as she's needed to function in this piece of art. So she's actually blown into the center by Zephyr. Um, and in this way, she doesn't come across as being dominant or domineering. She's focal, but only focal because that's the need of the poem. So she does not try. This is not a boasting. This is not an attempt to assert control over the center. She is the center because that is uh, that is the need of the piece of work here. To be just like the center, well, again, we are talking about the golden or nude of a later date, uh, a derivative, something that can only exist in comparison, um, that in and of itself is a pretense, whereas there is no pretense here. There is harmony and flow, and no ego. So, what more can we say about this pretense to Venus? We'll go in an intenser calm. Well, an intenser calm implies that there is a merely intense calm. Well, let's deal with that first. What could an intense calm be? Well, when I first um, encountered this, again, I have a desire to make meaning out of this poem within the constraints of what's possible, at least so insofar as I understand the possibilities. And when I thought of an intense calm, I thought of the calm before the storm. Now, the calm before the storm here, the storm functions as a metaphor for the coming uh, deluge of company or complications of upcoming travel. Perhaps we're waiting in the departure lounge, and soon our trip would begin, and then we would be in 11 cities in 10 days. It's not a literal storm, but the storm is a metaphor for a very, very complicated, fraught situation. And again, when I mentioned what the poem implies, by again, this is a whole structure of implication. We first have to imply that there's this horizon, and then we have to imply that there are clouds on this horizon. And when I say there are clouds on the horizon, likewise, I'm signaling. I say that this seems like it has the hallmarks of a coming storm. Now, there are literal clouds on the horizon, and there are figurative clouds on the horizon. So here we are somewhere in between either an analogy or we are dealing with a metaphor. Now, the whole mention of torrent clearly intimates a larger storm. Maybe we should talk about torrent for a moment. Well, it's a fast, incredibly fast, massive gush of water. Now, it can be something, if we're talking about whitewater rapids, we were, uh, our canoe was toppled by the torrent of water. But when we talk about the torrent of water, we don't reference the banks of the river or any other naturally occurring formation of water. That's irrelevant. The torrent is something that overcomes us forcefully. And certainly in the case of a storm, such a torrent would be a chance feature, not necessarily an existing feature. I mean, you could talk about a normally meandering lazy river that turns into a massive torrent of water. Again, it's gone over its bounds, and it simply poses a danger, a threat to everything around it. Now, what's interesting is there seems to be a tremendous compression. If this is indeed the calm before the storm, we sense a storm is coming, and then this is the innards of the storm. Uh, these are all coexisting at the same exact moment in time. A compression is though that we're, again, as though that we could see and experience time in all moments, the anticipation of the storm, as well as being in the storm itself, seemingly at the same moment. But it's not just an intense calm. It's not just the calm before the storm. It is an intenser calm. Now, you can say that. I mean, obviously, this is Stevens has a penchant for expressing his comparatives this way. We would normally say in a more intense calm. Intenser sounds better. It works in the sentence. He's very famous for doing this. And you can say this. I could talk about some. He's intenser. He's intenser than most. I could say that, and no one would correct me. I mean, not standard, but it falls within the general realm of acceptable usage. You can say these kinds of things. But although you can mostly say this, it's impossible to conceive. How can you have a calm intenser than an intense calm? How can the calm before the storm be what? Stormier? Cal- Calmer? It's just impossible to conceive of it. It's another impossibility. It's sayable, but it's impossible in contrast to um, what we said before, that you could have something like not as when the golden nude will go. It's not only unsayable, it's impossible. So what we might say is that there's building tension, there's building pressure on usage. So we can use language in such a way that There's no conflict with usage. However, the more creative we are, as Stevens is, your use comes into contact. You actually press up against the usage in order to, well, to create a desired effect, to be rebellious, perhaps. Uh, Potentially, there's even a desire to escape usage. Now, of course, the whole thing about escaping usage is it's delusional, it's deceptive, because even if you were able to somehow, if you thought you had escaped usage and transcended usage, well, you're still back in usage. You never left to begin with. You're trapped in that circle in something that's ultimately self-referential, meaning the usage that you and all of members of your tribe use unconsciously and maybe obliviously. And I would like to say that I think the artist would like to snap us out of this obliviousness, this blind usage, as Ezra Pound once said, "Blast apathy, blast that apathetic use of language and make it different." If for no other reason that to know what you're doing, to know that you are stuck in usage, but you want to remind yourself of the nature of the language that you express yourself in, either internally or you vocalize. So, a certain stress is being put on usage as we confront an impossibility. Then this interesting phrase, scullion of fate. Well, what does scullion mean? I had to look it up. Scullion is an archaic word. It refers to a menial kitchen worker, the person assigned the lowest, the hardest, the dirty work in the kitchens of the 16th century. Also, it became a way of insulting people. In Shakespeare, one could be called a scullion, meaning you're a lowly, despicable person. Now, recall earlier in the poem, we said, but not in Michelle, she starts archaic for the sea. I pointed out that archaic was sort of floating there as a word. It didn't agree with anything in the sentence, but we could argue that she starts for the sea. This sounds rather formal or rather archaic, and it was a way of expressing or drawing attention to the archaic usage without coming out and saying, "Hey, check out how unlike proper current English is. Look how dated the sentence is." So it had a interesting use earlier on. And so now we have an actual archaic word in a context of usage which is being challenged. The usage is always, in a sense, we could say that we are almost like the police of usage, because when we encounter something like she starts with the C, we say, "Wait, that's not how to speak English." Or where did you learn English? We are like someone checking ch- checking IDs on the street. Do you belong here? This doesn't belong here. Scullion, we that obviously, unless you I was going to say, unless you are exceptionally well read, better read than I am, and had already known that, you too would know. Well, that's how they used to speak. Clearly, your red flag goes up if someone says Scullion. This you said, well, this is not someone who speaks common usage. There's something wrong with using scullion in everyday speech, unless you're being highly ironic with other, people in the know. But knowing what scullion means, it's now impossible not to see it as casting doubt on the true beauty, the how golden is the goldener nude when she is equated with a scullion, whereas she's merely like the center, like this particularly um, de- deflationary way of um, of describing, or should I say, deriding, caricaturing the Venus. She is the scullion. Um, this is the first time that there has been, I guess you could say, a positive equivalence to say what she is, as opposed to what she's like. How does she compare to other things? But wait a second. She's not just a scullion. She is scullion of fate. Here is another extreme contrast. We have, on the one hand, fate, which determines how life will go. It's the set of um, accidental chance occurrences, which we can imagine mythologically are these beings who are actively shaping our lives with someone who is beneath contempt for us. So this is quite an unusual phrase that fate is, in a sense, almost represented, in the sense that perhaps a delegation might represent a country. The scullion is how fate presents itself. But again, this is what we might even say are incommensurable. We have someone who only has power over the roughest and down and dirtiest kind of activities, um, power over no one except pots and pans, versus those entities that control everything, uh, everything in human life, of every human life from highborn down to the scullion. Now, there are triads in this poem. There are the triads of the Paltry Nude, the Venus, and the Golden Nude of a later day, and also there are the triad of adjectives. There's the positive, there is the comparative, and there is the superlative. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the triad of fate: Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos or Atropos. These are the three figures who determine our fate, determine when our life will begin, how our life will unfold, and how it will end. But also, they are represented by rather common figures, archaic figures too. Clotho is the spinner. Lachesis is the one who measures the thread that the Clotho spins, and Atropos simply cuts. These are three old women who are modeled on women involved in the domestic economy. They are working potentially in the same household as our scullion is. And would have to be a rough democracy among all of these individuals. These are the people who are involved in toil. Now, this would have been toil of a bygone time when we had spinners, when we had scullions. Now we have uh, industries of scale where all of these things are largely taken out of our hands. However, there is still toil. And this brings us to this interesting phrase, the spictorant. Now, this word is not used by itself. It's used in the phrase spick and span. And spick and span is used in the sense of a cleanliness that one achieves through toil, particularly in the home. It's a toil. It's the product of toil that would have been, quite familiar to a spinner or to a scullion when we get down on our hands and knees and we're scrubbing the dirt away. And we do this in order not merely to have a clean home, but to be able to reproduce home life and to reproduce ourselves on a daily basis as the larger part of keeping ourselves alive in the context of the larger civilization, keeping itself alive and reproducing itself into the future. Now, what's interesting is that we could snap spick from spick and span, and our mind immediately goes back to the phrase spick and span. Again, we're like the police. We're recombining things according to the rules of usage. And Stevens, in his use here, has really contradicted usage. It's broken usage, but it didn't destroy usage because usage is something that is bigger than he is, bigger than we are, something that we, I guess you could say, succumb to. But the phrase itself, spictorrent, is a almost an expression of, again, incommensurables. Something that's spick and span is a function, is a is a consequence of a certain level of force, force applied on the human level. A torrent is incomprehensibly greater and inappropriate for the work of the domestic. In fact, a torrent is something that can end our lives. It could wash our community away. So as I say, this is another sort of strange compression of extremes in the same way of saying an intenser calm, um, or previously the sheer uh, incommensurable nature of this Venus with humans. We often talk about gods as being incommensurable with humans, and so the whole notion of applying human justice to immortals would be completely absurd. I guess the best that I could do with Spictorrent is to say that it's somehow meant to create an intimacy of the human and the elemental, but it's an intimacy that's only possible in the in a deformation of language like spictorrent, the destruction of a phrase that even in spite of which the phrase survives and the meaning is preserved. Of course, meaning survives until it can't in in a worked usage, which brings us to the last phrase here, upon her irretrievable way. Now, upon her irretrievable way might sound fluid. That's why Stevens constructed it that way. But this is a complete violation of usage. It is completely unsayable. You could take the individual words from upon her irretrievable way, and you can say what would work, what combinations of uh, preposition and noun would work together, and what meanings they would have. But as it stands now, this is broken usage, and it signifies the end of the the end of a ex- experimental endeavor, the end of an experimental project in which language is stressed to its extreme, and whereupon no meaning can come, at least from the structure as it's presented to us. Now, earlier in the poem, we talked about purple stuff upon her arms. Now, saying upon her arms, that's somewhat formal. We would more typically say purple stuff on her arms. However, in this phrase, upon her irretrievable way, you can't use upon, you can only say on her way. And if that's what you want to say, that she's on her way, that means she's left her source, her origin, and she is on her way to another destination. It might be her final destination, um, and but we don't know what she'll do after that point. But if someone calls me, "Where's Claire?" I say, "Well, Claire is on her way. She'll be there. She's left this place," and there's nothing in that phrase that says that Claire is coming back. I need more of the story to know if indeed she will be. Additionally, uh, Irretrievable is barely used. We generally talk about something being irretrievably lost, such as our defeat is complete, the situation is irretrievably lost. And certainly, you cannot say that a way is irretrievable. You could say that, although it's not usage, someone would understand if you as the item is irretrievable. Uh, I know what you mean. You can't go back and get it. You really can't say that. Certainly, the situation with this sentence is irretrievably lost, as the sentence itself cannot mean because it has been so deformed and usage has been so thoroughly undermined. Maybe a final thing that I can say, this is a very long video, too long, is that the future uh, is already irretrievably lost to us. Um, we can't see it, we can't experience it. We can make some predictions based upon patterns, but as time passes, those patterns mean ever less and less, and our attempts to say anything to penetrate the future, to make any sort of predictions, are as meaningless as the sentence is. Although, obviously, I can construct an archaeology, I can do a dig of the sentence and retrieve fragments of a lost meaning and put it together. But what's funny about this is that that is an archaeology. Whereas this whole sentence, this whole ending, would, as I've said before, seems to imply a posterity in which something is projected into the future and is forever. We like posterity because if I know that the things we love today will be loved tomorrow and in 100 years, we somehow feel that we are remembered. We're taken along. Our essence is preserved in it. And I certainly don't want to poo-poo that. But that's the driving force between posterity. So whatever aim the artist has, there's always that desire to live through, to live on, to survive, to escape. We can't escape usage, and we can't escape fate. Um, but there is, at least imaginatively, we can dream that we will continue on. Now, as another final thing, this word upon, and I couldn't help thinking, and maybe now it fits in better if I said once upon a time. And once upon a time, invariably, says ends with we have a story, and they lived happily ever after. There's an idea of also a ceaselessness of the well-being of the people who were dear to us, the people who were the heroes of the fairy tale, who go on and on and on. We're not told what they do because that is an undisclosed future to us. But we know that they do go on in a happy way, and we don't have to confront what must happen to anything mortal, and it must break down um, and disappear and cease to communicate with us. So I'll leave it at that. Um, I hope you enjoy these videos, if anybody indeed is watching them, and I hope to do more Stephen's videos. But this has been very worthwhile to me. So thanks and bye bye.